I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. Thank you for watching this video, and the topic of this video that I would like to discuss is the skepticism of the ENTP and INTP, and understanding the skepticism through an analysis of their cognitive functions, primarily the two axes that comprise the INTP and the ENTP's major conscious functions, which would be the TIFE axes, the NESI axes, and understanding the dynamics of these two axes and how they would create a pattern of skepticism in these two personality types. So INTPs and ENTPs are essentially sister types. They're roughly the same types, but you do get drastically different patterns of behavior out of them because of the arrangement of their cognitive functions, which one has more dominance and sort of polarity in the orbital space of their psychic constitution. But at the same time, there seems to be these gross similarities between the two that consistently stand out, whether or not you're looking at famous ENTP such as Richard Feynman or the philosopher Rene Descartes. There's certain aspects of them, or even somebody who is so superficially different in Paul Dirac from somebody like Richard Feynman, for example. So there are these very great gross superficial differences between the two, but there seems to be a quite substantial amount of similarity between the two, in which primarily it can be expressed through the skepticism of the INTP and the ENTP. And so I would like to talk about where that skepticism arises from and why it's not something that's just solely in the ENTP, which people would naturally ascribe to the ENTP because of their hyper-exploratory nature and trying to take in every aspect and vantage point of reality that they can possibly seem to drink in life, and why that's also something that's very much apparent in the more sedentary and reclusive INTP, or the INTP, which can be more sedentary and reclusive in their lifestyle than the ENTP might be. So first, I think I'll begin with the TIFE axes and talking about skepticism, because the TIFE axes, I think one can understand it and sort of asking two questions. One, what do I know and how can I communicate it? Two, what's the underlying generally important patterns of something? Because extroverted feeling looks at things as if at bottom they are the same. They come from the same source, they're cut from the same cloth. Whether you're dealing with people or objects, things are generally the same, no matter how superficially different they appear. Underlying those superficial differences, at bottom and at heart, all things are the same. This differs from the TEFI axis that starts with the proposition that things have differences, and it is the differences in the things that determine the scope, measure, and existence of the thing. The differences are what matter to introverted feeling. That's why it's particularly starts from a vantage point of differentiation, but for the FE function, it starts with the differences aren't important, it's the similarities and what makes things the same. So TIFE, it essentially steps away from the immediate standpoint or the immediate looking at something and takes a step back and asks what's generally true or what's sort of universally true about the thing. It wants to know specifically, when you take and put TI into the picture with FE and you create an axis, the axis essentially asks what's true given all time, what's true for all time, given any space, given any context, given any period, no matter how grossly locally things seem to differ and change. What is universally true and what is underlying all things at which we see. So introverted thinking and extroverted feeling, they put a bent in INTPs and ENTPs in general to look for universality and to look at universality for causality in things, or universality in their ultimate conclusion about things. And so that's the TIFE axes. Now moving to the NESI axes. So introverted sensing is a function that's not understood very well, and sensing in general is about what's extant within the environment, what exists and is contextualized within the environment, what's readily there before us or that we're seeing, what physical facts constitutes whatever we're surrounded with and whatever we're enmeshed in. That's what sensing is interested in. It's interested in the physical properties and the immediate properties of the environment itself, what's happening in the now. Now, introverted sensing, that's more indicative of extroverted sensing. You can just sort of differentiate them by putting an E or an I next to it, but it seems introverted sensing, it starts with the now and the physical facts and how they relate to the individual. So the abstractions and impressions that it creates, and it may seem strange that I'm using the word abstraction for a sensing function, but introverted sensing, I think all introverted functions to some respect create abstractions. They create psychological content. They create impressions and patterns, sort of like Michael Pierce describes this as a older photographic plate. They leave these imprints, and these things get impressed and enmeshed on the psyche, and they stay there and take an existing form and create some sort of psychological structure, and SE takes and uses that to decide about how it feels about an object, or sort of behavioral patterns, just behavioral wisdom. So that's SI. And it's an SI also too is pretty resistant to change. This is something that's very important in understanding, I think, in understanding SI, just the ENTP and the INTP skepticism, and so far as that they're being led by extroverted intuition, which is telling them to see that all that they can possibly see, which I'll get to later. But SI, because it's resistant to change and it's trying to create the best sort of behavioral model out of the impressions that it's been given, sort of to direct its actions and the wisdom it has towards things. It's system building and it's system creating. It's the system building and system creating portion, I believe, of the INTP that I think it's the system building structure or the system building tool in the INTP and the ENTP, and why ENTPs may not be as readily excited to codify information. So this is to say this, that SI is meticulous because it's resistant to change in some respects, and it's not the dominant thing being expressed, and extroverted intuition is the dominant one being expressed. SI still has a interplay with extroverted intuition. You won't find a function acting on its own, and so this interplay causes NE to be skeptical, or just to be, it will try on everything, but it will not accept everything. So just because an extroverted intuitive type is willing to dip in to so many things and wear so many different hats, doesn't mean they're going to keep all those hats. In fact, they wear all those hats so they can kind of figure out, because of SI, what hats to discard and which ones to keep. So, moving on to extroverted intuition. Though I talked about it quite extensively in my description of introverted sensing, it's to say that extroverted intuition is concerned with a multitude of possibilities emerging from objects within the environment. It's creating, it seems to me, just from my analysis, and not particularly what other people say, they say the multifaceted aspects of it, but it seems to me, being an extroverted intuitive type, when I think about what my extroverted intuition is doing in the environment, it's pulling out the essential characteristics that are in objects, then abstracting those and mapping them onto other objects, and that's how possibilities emerge. So it's not that the possibilities are something that's extant within extroverted intuition so much as it's this connective, it's being able to abstract from the item and pull out the essential characteristics of the item and look at other objects and see those essential characteristics in it, and taking what you know is functionally possible with that because of the essential characteristics of that and mapping it onto the other item, though superficially it may not seem that they share these essential characteristics, but extroverted intuition sees that they do, so it takes these essentialities and it maps them onto differing objects that seem of different proportion, size, class, family, whatever, what have you. Essentially equates them to having the sort of same modalities and same modes of use, and that's where it gets its novelty from, putting things together that appear in all reality different, but in some respects it's not even the actual respects of how the item exists in the environment, but what the item's functionality is, what it can do. Extroverted intuition seems to be concerned with what things can do, and it takes what it can do and then maps it onto something else and creates new things out of that thing, because the do's translate, but the outward expression or the object itself, they don't translate. So you may take a brick and you may give a brick the same function as a paperweight. The outward appearance aren't the same, but what they can do essentially are the same. So you can come up with these sort of novel and creative, out-of-the-box sort of problem-solving schematics. But it's to say that even when you look at the meticulous and resistant nature of introverted sensing, when you look at the sort of broad-reaching and far-searching nature of extroverted intuition, there's less reasons to believe that an INTP or an ENTP is going to be convinced of something so quickly, and it's not necessarily going to want to accept things so quickly. They have no problem trying things on, but INTPs and ENTPs, we are reticent to accept things. That's just period. Whether they're experiences, whether they are facts, whether they are arguments, whatever it is, an INTP and an ENTP, given our conscious cognitive functions, we're not going to want to accept something as soon as other types will accept it. There's nothing, and certainly the mechanisms that they have to appeal to for us to accept things are rather difficult and hard. So that's the rough picture, but then let's get to the nitty-gritty details in some extent in talking about introverted thinking and sort of why INTPs, at least I think, because I think INTPs and ENTPs being skeptical is something that can be explained by the arrangement of their cognitive functions, just the ones that they have that are more proportionally dominant in their personality than others, just their conscious cognitive functions. But I too also believe it's the nature of just introverted thinking in some respects, and its nature as an introverted function, and what is primarily concerned with too, that keeps sort of the ENTP and the INTP skeptical, because they're concerned with the answer for all time, not the answer for now, not the answer for tomorrow, but the answer for all time. What's true and what's false. Ultimately, roughly, that's where they want to slice things. It's this sort of binary dichotomy that exists in their mind that they're trying to, even if items don't essentially fit perfectly into those two categories, true and false, they'll make separate categories. At least I know for myself, I'll make separate categories about this thing may not be true in this situation, but I make a new category of situation. It's true there and it's false here. So I still make binary relationships even. I just make more detailed categorizations for things, and my schema get a little bit more sophisticated. But essentially, I'm still trying to do this true-false game with all things. And so that's where introverted thinking is going to take the individual and their thinking. And so something that's important to understand when the TIFE axis is asking what's true for all time, it's also to see where TI's orientation is, insofar that it's an introverted thinking function, and all introverted functions, they're concerned with the subject first, insofar as they're concerned with the impressions and contents that are already extant or existent within a subject before making a decision about the objective world. Essentially, all introverted functions, they believe that there's something internal that governs the actual objective reality, or that governs the objective facts. The inside world determines what's true about the outside world. Essentially, introverted feelers do this with their values. Introverted sensors do this with their experience and the behavioral wisdom that emerges from them, these experiences. And introverted thinking does it through its analyses and the models that it constructs from analyses, largely through experience. So it's to say that introverted thinking, and I said this in another video, I'm not adverse to facts, but facts don't mean anything outside of context to me. I don't stop at the facts. I'm not shy towards facts insofar as that they attract me or they repel me. I'm just not conservative with them. They don't stop me, and they don't mean anything to me outside of context. And so introverted thinking, unlike extroverted thinking, starts with the theories, moves to facts, then ends with theory. It's essentially, because it's trying to figure out what's true for all time, you can't see that in the immediate context of the situation. You can't see that in the immediate circumstances. You can look at two people arguing. They can be arguing for a specific reason, but is that the reason they're arguing? Is that why people argue in general? And no, that's not. It maybe has some component of it, but that's not it. And because introverted thinking and extroverted feeling want this globalized perspective, it's not even going to deal with the facts necessarily, because the facts, I mean, they're important, but they're not important to the overall question that we're asking. Essentially, when we're thinking about something, it's just to say that you need the theoretical model and you need the universal model to actually figure out what's true and what's false for all time. And it may just seem rather silly that the INTP or the ENTP even is geared that direction or moves towards that, but I mean, it's necessary, quite honestly, to even get results in the environment. Some of the most powerful theories we have in physics are from introverted thinking, and sort of the question of asking what's true for all time and just not what's locally consistent. Not to harp on Newton's model, but it's like, yeah, it's functional, but when you want to go outside of functionality per se and use the nature of reality to just figure out what's true, insofar as just knowing what nature is and how it represents itself, you have to ask questions about universality. That's essentially how you, well, yeah, anyways, you do. And I'm not gonna digress. I'm going to try to stay fairly linear in this, in saying that, okay, that's, so when people tend to present information to INTPs and ENTPs, they don't first consider this sort of logical structure and asking the logical question about what their conclusions mean and where they lead them to, where the final stopping point in the logical sort of analysis is for that statement or that idea or just whatever argument or position they're presenting to us. And the INTP, the ENTP, and a lot of NP types, we know essentially because of NE that there's not just one side to things. There's no one side of the coin. There's two sides of the coin. And that's if we're talking about a coin. But if we're talking about 9-sided dice or 10-sided dice or 12-sided dice, dodecahedrons, whatever we're talking about, there's multiple faces that you have to look at. You can't actually come to a valid conclusion with just that. And when we're inspecting information, we're looking for whether it's true all time, but we're also looking to see if it fits all of these potential situations that it could find itself in. Is it functional given all the spaces that it could exist in when you think about what the idea is? If it's not true for all time, and even if we're talking about something being efficient or effective or not, it doesn't fit into multiple spaces. It doesn't have much utility to it. Yeah, we're not gonna be so quick to accept that. In fact, we may not accept it at all. And the it's like it's for this reason that we have such a heavy time and skeptical leaning towards things. And then I want to talk about, per se, just given that, the difference between the NISE axis and why NI may be much more accepting of things from the environment than NE, because NI is paired with extroverted sensing, and extroverted sensing is in the here and now and has a sort of intense vantage point on reality and wants to essentially be one with it in the now, in the know, being in the moment as it is, and using those aspects of the physical facts and the way reality sets up to determine the impressions and the various abstractions that it's going to use to make and construct its model. It starts with a lot of, NI starts with a lot of known facts and grounded facts, things that are extant, that it can just somewhat guarantee is true because of them being so frequent and so present within the environment and what they see. That's why INTJs and INFJs and most extroverted sensing individuals think of themselves as empiricist or empirical in their conclusions. And I'm not going to talk about whether or not they're really as empirical as they think that they are in their conclusions. I'm just going to say that they have a bent in a mode to empiricism, that they really think that they can trust their senses, they can trust their just the physical world. And that's not something that NESI necessarily buys into, because introverted sensing is not the same as extroverted sensing. Introverted sensing, it values the physical environment, but it doesn't necessarily value the facts and the objects in the environment, or have a friendly relationship with them. It wants to withdraw itself from objects and from the environment, so that's not its impetus. That's not even where it's going or how it looks at the world. So it's just to say that, because I was talking to one of my friends who's an INFJ, and they could not understand why I sort of had the vantage point I have on so many things, and I have 3 categories in my mind: true, false, and I don't know. And a lot more lives in I don't know than true and false. To where for my INFJ friend, a lot of things live in true or false, and I don't know how they can be so confident about the things that they read or the things that they see, because I don't trust human reason to some extent, and I don't trust the senses very readily, and they're not trustworthy to me, and I know that. I don't trust them per se, because extroverted sensing, if you're looking at it in my cognitive functions, is all the way in my shadow functions and is my deception function. It deceives, physical facts deceive me sometimes, or they can deceive me, and I can be deceived by my dislike for distrust per se. It's not a dislike, because I don't dislike facts, and I don't dislike them at all. I think they're very, very useful, but I don't necessarily trust them. I can't trust them because they don't come from a perfect source. And I think that's why you get Descartes' position as an INTP and his I think therefore I am, because what can you trust and what can you absolutely know for certain? It's rather difficult for even an INTP. I like certainty as an INTP, but I don't have this same. I'm certain about some things, and I think some things are true and are just make sense, but I'm not really certain about a whole lot of things, because I know very well that what foundation we're standing on determines a lot of what we conclude. And how do you even know to trust the foundation of what you're standing on? It depends on what it's made out of. If you're talking about pure reason, there's a problem with that because it has to arise from the intuition, just the a priori knowledge sources that you use. It has to arise from the intuition, and intuition is created by expectations and what you experience in your local environment. So you may think you're getting this globalized picture, given the fact that you're a human being. Is that what's really occurring? It may be, it may not be, but it's just to say, can you absolutely trust it without a shadow of a doubt in that means of ascertaining some knowledge or the truth? And just from my vantage point, no, not even for myself. Just don't trust it completely. Empiricism. Can you completely trust the technology and the senses? And I've already made a video on measurement where I essentially laid out an argument for saying, no, you can't. It's not to say that they're not important or they're not useful, but you can't just completely trust them. And same thing about statistics and numbers. You can't just completely trust them. There's a bit of reason and logic that has to be applied to those things. There's a good deal of reason and logic that has to be applied to those things so that they are even useful. But even on the flip side, for the pure rationality, there's a great deal of empiricism that has to be applied to it to actually help it come to the best conclusions it can come to. Because independent of one another, and logic and empiricism, they don't actually make good choices, I don't think. And because you can't trust them in of themselves on their own. They're not good on islands, just from my perspective. But it's just, if I'm talking about my physical senses, there's such things as optical illusions. Your senses will deceive you at certain junctions and points in time. And my friend, the INFJ, he said, yeah,